I have seen a lot in my 43 years on the bench. I have watched people lie to my face, cry crocodile tears, and try every trick in the book to bury the truth under paperwork and procedure. I have seen smirks in this courtroom, the nervous kind, the defiant kind, the kind that comes from ignorance and the kind that comes from arrogance. But I have never, in all my decades wearing this robe, had a defendant sit through an entire trial with a smirk on his face that never wavered. Not during testimony about sick children, not during a mother's tears, not during a doctor's sworn statement that patients had died. A smirk so fixed and so permanent that it looked carved into his face, until I read page 47 of a report that he himself had written, and the smirk disappeared so fast you would have thought someone had reached across the courtroom and slapped it off him. Until the morning of September 9th, 2025, at exactly 10:03 a.m., when Dr. Julian Frost, CEO of Vantage Therapeutics, a man whose company earned $1.8 billion last year, discovered that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a judge, not a jury, and not a prosecutor. It is your own words. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I am about to tell you is a story about a man who could not stop smiling at other people's suffering, and what happened when his own document erased that smile forever. Let me take you back to how this whole thing started. The case file was the largest I had received in a decade. Case number 2025-CV-7291, fraud, criminal negligence, suppression of adverse drug data, and reckless endangerment resulting in patient deaths. The defendant was Dr. Julian Frost, age 55, PhD in molecular pharmacology from Johns Hopkins, CEO of Vantage Therapeutics for the past 11 years, a man who had graced the cover of 3 business magazines and had given a TED Talk titled Radical Transparency in Modern Medicine. The complainants were represented collectively by the families of 9 patients who had suffered severe cardiac events, including 3 deaths linked to a drug called Corvaline, an anti-inflammatory medication manufactured by Vantage Therapeutics and prescribed to over 200,000 patients nationwide. But the face of this case, the person who brought it from a whisper to a courtroom, was a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, age 38, a clinical pharmacist at a community health center in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, who earned $27 an hour and spent her evenings reading clinical trial data because she believed that the numbers in a study were not abstractions, they were patients. And she was right. I need you to understand Amara before I tell you about page 47. Amara's parents came to Rhode Island from Accra, Ghana in 1992. Her father, Kwame, drove a taxi in Providence for 19 years. Her mother, Abina, worked as a home health aide, caring for elderly patients. They saved everything. They sacrificed vacations, new clothes, restaurant meals, anything that was not essential, so their daughter could go to college. Amara graduated from the University of Rhode Island School of Pharmacy and chose to work at a community health center instead of a chain pharmacy because she said, "The people who need the most help get the least attention. I want to be where the attention is needed." She made $27 an hour. She had been there for 12 years. Amara's daughter, Nadia, was 9 years old. Nadia had been born premature at 28 weeks and had chronic respiratory issues that required a specialist and medication costing $480 a month after insurance. Amara's husband, Kofi, was a high school math teacher making $41,000 a year. Between them, they had $7,200 in savings. Amara worked overtime whenever it was available. She brought Nadia to the clinic on days when school was closed because she could not afford a sitter, and she would not call in sick. Nadia sat in the break room doing homework while her mother counted pills and reviewed prescriptions and asked the questions that other pharmacists had stopped asking. If you have ever looked at a paycheck that does not match the hours you gave and gone back to work anyway because the people on the other side of the counter are counting on you, then please subscribe to this channel. We are a family here, and Amara's story is why this channel matters. Join us now. When Amara walked into my courtroom, she was wearing a white lab coat over dark slacks and a simple blouse. She had come from the clinic. Her hospital badge was still clipped to her pocket. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a thick binder, tabbed with colored flags. the kind of binder that represents hundreds of hours of reading, cross-referencing, and documenting. She sat down, placed the binder on the table, and opened it to a page she had marked. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. She had the look of a woman who had done her homework and was not afraid of the test. Before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me what you think page 47 said. Because when I read it out loud, the most powerful man in this courtroom collapsed. Here is what happened. Corvaline was approved by the FDA in 2021 for the treatment of chronic inflammatory conditions, including rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. It was marketed as a safer alternative to existing anti-inflammatories with fewer gastrointestinal side effects. Vantage Therapeutics priced it at $2,100 per month. The clinical trials had shown promising results. But there was a problem buried in the data that Amara found, because she did something most people do not do. She read the entire study, not the summary, not the abstract, not the marketing brochure. She read every page of the Phase 3 clinical trial report, all 312 pages of it, because a patient at her clinic, a 67-year-old woman named Dolores Mendez, who had been taking Corvaline for 8 months, had come in with chest pains and an irregular heartbeat that her cardiologist could not explain. Amara started digging. She pulled the trial data from the FDA's public access database. She read it at night after Nadia went to sleep, sitting at her kitchen table with a highlighter and a notepad. And on page 47 of the Phase 3 clinical trial report, a report authored by Dr. Julian Frost and submitted to the FDA under his signature, Amara found a paragraph that had been buried in a subsection titled Secondary Endpoint Analysis, Cardiac Observations. The paragraph described 7 cases of elevated troponin levels and ST segment abnormalities in trial participants receiving the highest dose of Corvaline. Elevated troponin is a marker for cardiac muscle damage. ST segment abnormalities indicate potential heart attack. 7 cases. In a trial of 412 patients. That is a cardiac event rate of 1.7%. The FDA's threshold for mandatory cardiac safety review is 1.5%. The paragraph was there, in the report, on page 47. It described the cardiac events accurately. And then, in the final sentence of the paragraph, the report stated, "These observations were deemed clinically non-significant and are not expected to affect the overall safety profile of the compound." Deemed clinically non-significant. 7 patients showed signs of heart damage, and the CEO of the company, the man whose signature was on the report, wrote that it was not significant. And the FDA, processing thousands of applications, reviewing hundreds of pages per submission, did not catch it. But Amara did. A pharmacist making $27 an hour at a community health center in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, caught what a billion-dollar company buried and a federal agency missed. And if you believe that one person reading one page can change everything, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments what you would do in my chair. Your support helps stories like this reach people who need them. Subscribe now. Amara filed a report with the FDA's MedWatch program. She contacted the Rhode Island Department of Health. She contacted a patient safety attorney named Catherine Riley, who took the case pro bono. Riley's investigation expanded the scope. They found that since Corvaline's approval, over 200 adverse cardiac event reports had been filed with the FDA by prescribing physicians. 9 patients had suffered major cardiac events. 3 had died. One was a 44-year-old mother of 2 named Sandra Nguyen from Cranston, who had been taking Corvaline for lupus and died of a sudden cardiac arrest while driving her children to school. Her car drifted across the center line. Her 12-year-old son in the passenger seat grabbed the wheel and steered them onto the shoulder. He saved his sister's life. He could not save his mother's. Let me say that again. A woman died behind the wheel because a pharmaceutical CEO looked at 7 cardiac events in a clinical trial and wrote the words, "clinically non-significant." And her 12-year-old son had to grab the steering wheel of a car his dead mother was no longer driving. That is what page 47 cost. That is what those words meant in the real world. Dr. Julian Frost arrived at my courtroom in a black Porsche Taycan Turbo S, a vehicle worth over $200,000. He walked in wearing a midnight blue Tom Ford suit, $5,000. His tie was Xenia, dark silver, $300. His watch was an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, stainless steel with blue dial, worth approximately $30,000. His shoes were Crockett & Jones, hand-stitched, $900. He had 3 attorneys, a pharmaceutical defense team from a firm in Washington, D.C. that specialized in FDA regulatory disputes. They sat down with quiet efficiency. Frost sat back, crossed one leg, adjusted his cuff, and smiled. He smiled at the courtroom the way a professor smiles at a lecture hall. He smiled when the charges were read. He smiled when the prosecution's opening statement described Sandra Nguyen's death. He smiled when Sandra's husband, David, who was sitting in the gallery holding the hands of his 2 children, lowered his head and tried not to cry. The smirk never wavered. It was the most disturbing thing I have witnessed in a courtroom in 43 years. It was as if suffering itself was beneath his attention. Amara was already seated, lab coat, badge, binder, steady hands. The prosecution presented the evidence, the adverse event reports, the cardiac data, Sandra Nguyen's death certificate, the autopsy report linking her cardiac arrest to inflammatory markers consistent with Corvaline's known pharmacological effects. Then Amara testified. She described reading the study. She described finding the paragraph on page 47. She described the phrase clinically non-significant and explained, in clear clinical language, why 7 cardiac events in 412 patients exceeded the safety threshold and should have triggered a mandatory review. She described Dolores Mendez, her patient, sitting in a plastic chair at the community clinic with chest pains that nobody could explain until Amara read 312 pages at her kitchen table. The courtroom was silent. Frost was still smiling. His attorneys presented the defense. Clinical interpretation, regulatory discretion, post-market surveillance ongoing. The cardiac events were within acceptable parameters when adjusted for comorbidities. Industry standard language. Then Frost insisted on speaking. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed me with the smooth confidence of a man who had presented to shareholders and congressional committees and had always walked out with his stock price intact. Your Honor, he said, Corvaline has helped over 200,000 patients manage debilitating conditions. Every medication carries risk. The cardiac observations in the trial were reviewed by our internal safety board and by the FDA. They were deemed within acceptable limits. Dr. Osei is a community pharmacist. She is not a clinical trial specialist. Her interpretation of the data, while earnest, is not authoritative. I stand behind the safety of our product. He was still smiling when he sat down. Your support helps these stories reach people who need them. If you have not subscribed, do it now. Because what happened next is the moment that broke through that smile like a hammer through glass. I picked up the binder Amara had brought. I opened it to the tab she had marked, page 47. I had read it the night before. I had read it again that morning, and now I read it out loud. I read the paragraph describing the 7 cardiac events. I read the troponin elevations. I read the ST segment abnormalities. And then I read the final sentence. These observations were deemed clinically non-significant and are not expected to affect the overall safety profile of the compound. I set the binder down. I looked at Frost and I said, Dr. Frost, you authored this report. Your signature is on the submission, is that correct? He said yes. I said, you wrote the words clinically non-significant to describe 7 patients who showed signs of cardiac muscle damage during your trial. Is that correct? He paused. He said, that was a clinical judgment made by our safety review board. I said, the report bears your signature, your name, your judgment, and 3 people are dead. I reached into the file. I pulled out a photograph. It was Sandra Nguyen's family portrait, David, their 12-year-old son, Kevin, their 9-year-old daughter, Lily. Sandra in the center, smiling, alive. I held it up. Dr. Frost, this is Sandra Nguyen. She was 44 years old. She had lupus. She trusted your drug. She died behind the wheel of her car. Her 12-year-old son grabbed the steering wheel and saved his sister's life. I want you to look at this photograph." Frost looked, and the smirk disappeared. Not gradually, not slowly. It vanished, like someone had pulled a mask off his face and there was nothing underneath but the hollow expression of a man who had just been confronted with the human cost of a sentence he wrote on page 47. The courtroom went dead silent. Sergeant Webb took a step forward. Dorothy stopped typing. David Nguyen was holding Kevin's hand so tightly his knuckles were white. Kevin was looking at the floor. He was 12 years old, and he had already done the bravest thing most adults will never have to do. My jaw was tight. My hands were flat on the bench. My father's voice, clear as morning. "The measure of a man is not what he has. It is what he is willing to admit." I took a breath, and I delivered my ruling. "Dr. Frost, I am fining you personally and Vantage Therapeutics jointly $50,000. That money will be placed in a court-administered trust for the families of the 9 patients who suffered cardiac events linked to Corvaline, with priority allocation to the Nguyen family for Kevin and Lily's educational and counseling needs. You will perform 600 hours of community service at the Pawtucket Community Health Center, the clinic where Dr. Osei works. You will sit in the pharmacy. You will watch prescriptions being filled. You will look at the faces of patients who trust that the medication they are taking will not kill them. And you will understand that every pill and every bottle carries your name and your judgment and your signature. I am ordering Vantage Therapeutics to issue an immediate safety communication to all prescribing physicians regarding the cardiac risk data on page 47, data that should have been communicated 3 years ago. And I am referring all evidence to the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, the Department of Justice, and the Rhode Island Attorney General for criminal prosecution under federal drug safety statutes. You smiled through this entire trial, Dr. Frost. You smiled when Sandra Nguyen's death was described. You smiled when her husband tried not to cry. You smiled because you believed that your clinical language and your regulatory process and your 3-attorney defense team made you untouchable. But page 47 was always there. You wrote it. You signed it. You buried it in a subsection and used the words "clinically non-significant" to describe 7 human beings whose hearts were damaged by your drug. And then 3 people died. In my courtroom, words have consequences. Your words, on your page, under your signature. You cannot smile your way out of your own report. The courtroom erupted. People stood. Applause filled the room. David Nguyen pulled his children close. Kevin lifted his head for the first time. Amara closed her binder slowly, the way a person closes a book they have been carrying for a long time. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She nodded once. The nod of a pharmacist who had done her job. I will not pretend I was composed. There were tears in my eyes. I looked at Sandra Nguyen's photograph still sitting on my bench, and I thought about a 12-year-old boy grabbing a steering wheel, and I thought about what page 47 cost the world. Frost sat at the defense table motionless. The Tom Ford suit, the Audemars Piguet, the Porsche in the parking lot. None of it could bring back the smirk. It was gone. What remained was the face of a man staring at the wreckage of a sentence he wrote 3 years ago that he thought no one would ever read. 6 months later, the FDA issued a black box warning for Corvaline, the most severe safety alert the agency can place on a medication. Vantage Therapeutics recalled 3 dosage formulations. The DOJ opened a criminal investigation into data suppression and fraudulent safety reporting. Julian Frost was placed on leave by the board and subsequently resigned. The SEC opened a parallel inquiry into whether Frost's failure to disclose known safety risks constituted securities fraud. 14 additional cardiac events were reported and linked to Corvaline after the safety communication was issued. Dolores Mendez, the 67-year-old patient whose chest pain started Amara's investigation, was taken off Corvaline and placed on an alternative medication. Her cardiac symptoms resolved within 6 weeks. She sent Amara a card that said, "You listened when no one else did. Thank you for reading." Amara Osei continues to work at the Pawtucket Community Health Center. She still makes $27 an hour. She still reads clinical trial reports at her kitchen table after Nadia goes to sleep. She was nominated for the Rhode Island Pharmacist of the Year award. She told me she did not do anything special. She said, "I just read the whole thing. Most people stop at the summary. I read every page. That is my job." 312 pages, one paragraph, one sentence, one pharmacist who would not stop reading. That is all it took. I think about that smirk. I think about Julian Frost sitting in my courtroom smiling while David Nguyen held his children and tried not to break. And I think about the moment I held up Sandra's photograph and the smirk vanished. That moment was not justice. Justice is the fine, the referral, the investigation. That moment was something else. It was recognition. The moment a man who had hidden behind clinical language and corporate process was forced to see what his words had done. Not in a spreadsheet, not in an adverse event report, in a family portrait. My father used to tell me, the measure of a man is not what he has. It is what he is willing to admit. Julian Frost had every opportunity to admit what page 47 meant. He had 3 years. He had 200 adverse event reports. He had 3 deaths. And he chose the smirk. He chose to believe that clinical language could make cardiac damage disappear. It cannot. Words on a page do not change what happens in a body. They just delay the moment when someone reads them out loud in a room where the truth matters. To anyone watching who works in medicine, in pharmacy, in research, in any field where your words become someone else's life, read every page. Do not skip the subsections. Do not trust the summary. Read every page the way Amara Osei read every page, because somewhere in those pages there might be a paragraph that saves a life, or ends one. And to anyone watching who has lost someone to a medication they trusted, who was told the risks were non-significant, who buried someone because a company buried a paragraph, remember Sandra Nguyen. Remember Kevin grabbing the wheel. Remember that one pharmacist in Pawtucket read the page that the CEO hoped no one would read. The truth is always on a page somewhere. It just needs someone brave enough to find it. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If you believe in real justice, do 3 things for me. Subscribe to this channel so stories like this reach every patient and every family who needs them. Leave a comment and tell me about a healthcare worker who goes above and beyond. And watch the next video, where a 92-year-old woman walks into court owing $18,000, and what she tells Judge Caprio breaks him completely. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that justice is not just a word, it is a promise. And I keep my promises.